Before we begin, we'd like to give special thanks to all of our sponsors for helping make this event possible each year. Specifically, thank you to CRL FormFox for being our title sponsor for 5 consecutive years. And thank you to our platinum sponsors, OraSure Technologies, Psychmedics, Samba Safety, UKG, and Quest Diagnostics.
Welcome to our session today. Good to have you here with us. You've joined the roundtable with the experts. Over the next hour or so, we're going to be talking about detection versus impairment and the benefits of breath testing for cannabis. We're glad you're here with us. My name is Atkinson. I woke up the other day and I realized that I've been in the drug testing space for the better part of 2 decades. It flies by as it is prone to do. I spent the better part of that time at Quest Diagnostics, took a brief hiatus from the industry for a couple of years, and then it pulls you back in. So I'm at Houndlabs, and I lead a team of marketers. At Hound, we're wholly focused on bringing a cannabis breathalyzer to the market to help employers confront all the challenges that we all know about cannabis. And we'll talk a lot more about that over the next hour or so. So I'm excited to be here. I'm excited to moderate this session. This group of esteemed panelists, really to know them is to love them, and I know them and I love them, and you might know them too. We'll take just a second here to have them introduce themselves. So Robin, why don't we start with you?
Thank you, Aaron. It's so great to be here. My name is Robin Schelling. I work for Chevron Corporation as the Global Substance Prevention Program and DOT Compliance Manager. I know that's a large title. It encompasses quite a few things. Just a little bit about me. I've been in the safety and health function for over 25 years now. Gosh, it goes by really fast. And I've been with Chevron going on 15. So I'm very excited to present with my colleagues here today. Thanks, Aaron.
Thanks, Robin. Over to you, Barry.
Thanks, Aaron. Pleasure to be here. I'm Barry Sample. I'm a member of Houndlabs Scientific Advisory Board. And for those of you who don't know me, I've been in clinical laboratory medicine, clinical toxicology, anti-doping analyses for more than 40 years now. And 30 plus of those years were spent with Quest Diagnostics, recently retired and enjoying this new role in my life. And just really happy to be here today and talking to you about cannabis breath testing.
Thanks, Dr. Sample. And Faye, your way.
Hi, I'm Faye Caldwell. I'm an attorney. I ask you not to hold that against me. Sometimes attorneys don't have a great reputation, but my firm and I specialize exclusively in drug testing, workplace drug testing, all the sorts of technical stuff for probably more decades than I want to admit to. Thank you for having me, Aaron.
Thanks, Faye. Glad you're here. So as we kind of lean into the panel, kind of see what we're setting up. We have Robin representing the employer perspective, Barry on the science and technology perspective, and Faye on the legal perspective. So I think we'll get a nice blend of perspectives over the next few minutes. So as we jump in, detection versus impairment, it's kind of a back to the future slide, right? If we look back, we think about the genesis of workplace drug testing, workforce drug testing. Generally, going back in time, sample types indicated primarily if a drug was used, but didn't really isolate if that use occurred proximate to the workday. And generally, a positive drug test result was linked to an adverse employee action. So if you were an applicant and you didn't pass your drug test, typically you didn't get the job offer. If you're a current employee and you failed your drug test, you may not be welcome to come back. Yeah, there's a lot of different flavors there, but generally that's how drug testing has worked over time. But as we look forward, some of that's changing, right? We feel the winds of change blowing. A lot of that's driven by one drug in particular, cannabis, and all the legalization that's happening there, impacting access, impacting use, impacting positivity. At the same time, there are state laws that are preventing some employers from taking the types of actions they've historically taken. So what are employers to do? You got more use, higher positivity, changing laws. What we see is an increasing removal of that particular drug from testing panels. It creates its own set of complications and challenges. We'll talk a bit more about that. And really what the desire of more and more employers is, it's not just, when a drug was used, but if that drug was used, and if that has an impact on the workday. So we'll shift a little bit into this idea of when, not just if, and what that means for testing programs into the future. Really, that last section is somewhat universal. If you've been in the drug testing space, this is not an aha moment, but really drug testing is in place to deter the safety impacting use of drugs that may impact all the things from productivity to fairness, all the other impacts there of turnover and theft and injuries and everything else. And then bottom line, what employers are endeavoring to do is to create legally compliant policies and have tools in place to support those policies. So these topics we'll talk more about as we go. Just a quick lean into detection versus impairment, where we've been and where we're going. One other slide to set us up. Really 5 bullets on the value of a cannabis breath test. And we'll hit each one here quite quickly. So the detection window of cannabis aligns with the workday. And as we said earlier, indicates when, not just if, the drug was used. Cannabis breath testing supports policies that prohibit recent use, most closely linked to those key safety risks. It aligns with emerging state laws and enables the continuation of testing. And it supports staffing objectives by expanding candidate and applicant pools. If traditional drug test types looked back further and have a longer detection window, there's the opportunity to impact employees and create HR and staffing challenges. By having a shorter window that aligns use and safety impacts, it changes the dynamic there a little bit. And then bottom line, breath testing is an additive and complementary tool to existing testing programs. It's one more tool on the tool belt for employers to use as they build these programs and build these policies. So with that said, let's jump into our roundtable and our panel. How it'll flow, generally we've got 3 or 4 questions for each panelist, and they've had access to those questions here for a few weeks. They put a few bullets on a slide that give us a kind of visual cue to their general answer. But really, I think the value will come from the nuances of what they have to say and what they have to share. And at the end of a couple of slides, we may get a little back and forth as Faye, for example, chimes in on a Robin or a Barry perspective. So what you'll see over the next few minutes is about 10 or 15 minutes from the employer perspective with Robin, 10 or 15 on the science and technology perspective with Dr. Sample, and then 10 or 15 minutes with Faye from a legal perspective. So let's dive right in. Robin, can you give us a little background on Chevron and our drug testing program? When and how did it all get started?
Absolutely. Thanks, Aaron. This is a great question. So, ultimately, drug testing became an integral part of our safety program right around the late 80s. So when we saw the Drug-Free Workplace Act of 1988 come into place, was really that policy-driven perspective that really we started to develop heavy drug test policies across our enterprise, especially in the United States. So Chevron's a safety sensitive industry. We have a lot of different types of work that are performed across the corporation. So we dabble, obviously we're an oil and gas company, but we've also got renewable energies, we've got human resources, public relations, sales departments, drilling and completions, transportation, aircraft operations, pipeline transfer, of course. And so most of the work that we do at Chevron has some element of a safety sensitive component to it. That doesn't mean that every job is safety sensitive in the full scope of what they do, but we put a rigorous drug and alcohol testing program in place for the purpose to ensure that our employees were safe and those working with us, around us, and our communities that for which we operate we were instilling some confidence in them as well, that we were operating in a safe manner.
Thanks, Robin. I think every employer who has a testing program has a genesis story, and obviously Chevron as a big brand in the safety sensitive space has that story. And I think that genesis is an important context as we go over the next couple of slides. So thanks for giving us that background. Long-standing program, and we'll dive into a bit more of the benefits and the advantages as we go.
Yes,
Jump
sir.
to the next slide. So when we think about Chevron, what value does your organization find in those testing programs that have been in place for so long?
The ultimate value is people. We get to ensure that our people go home in the same manner for which they came to work that day, and that's safe, free from the impacts of drug and alcohol in the workplace. In addition to that, it helps in our return on investment from a productivity perspective as well. So we get to ensure that our employees are happy and healthy at work. That's a huge program within our company. We have a huge employee assistance program as well. Across the industry, we're one of the few companies that actually offers a second chance program, and we have had that program in place for decades. I can't say since the inception of our program, but certainly longer than I've been in the industry. And the program really just recognizes that people are human and that takes each and every situation a little bit different and allows an employee to go through a rehabilitative program and come back to work on a return to work program to help them through that recovery process. And it's something that we're extremely proud of. We've got about a 79% overall program completion rate. And we judge that by the number of employees who complete the term of the program and maintain employment greater than 10 years. So to be at 79% on average, that's greater than any rehabilitative program that we have or see in our communities. So something we're very, very proud to have an offer to employees. We've seen a decrease in incidents. Chevron is all about safety, as I mentioned before. And so we put safety before all things. And so we are going to prioritize safety and health of our employees before we put our operations or financial gains ahead.
Thank you, Robin. So there's a lot there, right? You've been doing it for so long, it just kind of comes easily. Oh, this is how we do it, and this is a good thing, and we have data on this. If I'm an employer who's dialing in, thinking about, all right, how do I think about a workplace testing program? What does it mean at my organization? What's a best practice? Do we terminate? Do we give a second chance? How do we manage all those things? I think that's one of the key pieces about having you on the panel, this expertise of a leading employer who knows you have challenges and you have risks, but you have opportunities to take information and put a program in place that, as you shared earlier, it balances a lot of different goals at the same time: safety and fairness and objective results. So thank you for sharing that. One thing for our attendees at the end, we'll share everybody's contact information. If you're like, man, I'd sure love to know more from Rob, and Aaron should have asked this question, he didn't ask her as a follow-up, you can ask those questions of anybody after the event is over. Thanks, Rob.
Absolutely, sure.
Let's jump to the next one. So thinking ahead, right? Those first couple of slides really looked back on the genesis of the program. How does it work? What's in place there? As we think about cannabis breath testing, what's your thoughts around how that fits into your existing program, Robin?
Yeah, this is another great question. So as you'll hear from Barry and Faye, I mean, the landscape around cannabis testing is changing. And I know Faye doesn't really like when I use this analogy, but when I think about where we are with cannabis testing right now, it kind of reminds me of where we were with alcohol testing a long time ago, many, many years ago, right? So when you have legalization of alcohol, but we still had a right as an employer to ensure that employees weren't coming to work under the influence of alcohol. And so how were we able to combat that? Well, we have a breath detection device that gives us some quantitative measurement as to whether or not an employee has used alcohol or has it, used it readily in the last little while. Drug testing doesn't offer anything like that, or historically it hasn't. Yet we're starting to still see that legalization change across many states and potentially at the federal level. I think that we're all watching that close to see where it's at. But I think that ultimately that is the gap here, is that there isn't a way to really measure that impairment versus detection. Our historic programs always measured just the presence of a substance, right? Whether your oral fluids, your urine testing, hair testing, all that tells us is that there's something in your system. It doesn't tell us when exactly that was used, or how frequent, although we'll hear more about some of that specific from the expert in science. But ultimately, from an employer's perspective, we want to ensure that the employee is fit for duty when they show up to work every day, and stays fit for duty throughout their workday. And so this cannabis breath testing is a breath of fresh air for us, no pun intended there, but we're really excited about this technology to at least have the capability to narrow that window of detection to a point where we can say, maybe the removal of a person based on a non-negative test result is accurate here, and not based on 2 weeks ago when they were traveling or on vacation or something like that, which ultimately leads to our goal to safety and health in the workplace, and does the return on investment for our shareholders and employees and everybody. So I know it's very long-winded, but it's very exciting to talk about this and this new technology.
Well, it's hard for me as a marketer not to hear something like breath of fresh air and think about the air freshener trade show tchotchke that we'll get into production. I think it's a great idea.
Sure,
I think one more, Robin. We'll wrap up the employer perspective with, what's the value of a recent use cannabis test? And you kind of touched on this a little bit, but I think a few different words here just over the next minute or so.
Yeah, and I will reiterate, ultimately, it's just to be able to detect recent or pseudo recent use before work, right? It's all in that fitness for duty realm, making sure that the employee is able to perform the duties for which they're assigned. And that again is the ultimate goal, and really to be able to move our program forward to where we can have a life outside of the office that's consistent with perhaps state laws, wherever you may live, but that we have that surety around that fitness for duty. As you mentioned, it balances that workplace safety and fairness. It gives us the ability to measure fitness for duty instead of, again, hold something potentially against somebody who could have been weeks or months, or on a pre-employment, it could have been, 3 months ago. And then it will give us a bit more hiring pool. I think this is one of the issues that we're seeing across the nation right now, especially in states that have legalized the recreational use, is that the college students or those in the job market really don't think about the potential impacts or the types of testing employers may do. And so they're thinking they're abiding by state laws and that there's no harm in what they're doing. And then they find that they have, failed a drug screen for pre-employment. So this will allow us to, potentially give us that more recent use instead of relying on historical data. And then again, provides that reliable alternative for our business that we wanted to deter employees from using substances that cause impairment, But we also want to recognize that, similar to that of alcohol, when you're following the laws for which you live, it's hard to, as an employer, step back and say, you can't do that. So we're just excited to see this technology progress.
Robin, thank you. So are we. That's great stuff. So let's transition a bit from 3 or 4 slides from the employer and the Chevron and the Robin perspective to a couple of slides here for Dr. Sample to really speak to the science and technology of a cannabis breath test. So Barry, the first question here, a brief primer as we back up from cannabis breath testing, just generally, let's get up to speed on the science of drug testing. Can you give us a little bit of the PhD course in 2 minutes?
Sure. And since you mentioned course, let's talk about it as being maybe drug testing 101 to keep with that theme. So, basically, as we look at workforce drug testing, there are some key components, fundamental concepts that apply no matter what type of specimen type is being used, whether it's hair, oral fluid, urine, or breath. And included in these would be chain of custody, obviously. We need to be able to have absolute confidence that that specimen belongs to a certain donor. Another basic tenet is what we refer to as 2-tiered testing whenever you want to report a positive test. So there's a screening test, sometimes also called an initial test, on one portion of the specimen. In the event that that specimen is presumptively positive, there needs to be a confirmation test on a different portion of that original specimen. So you essentially have 2 independent tests. And that confirmation testing needs to occur with perhaps a new concept, definitive technology. And when we're talking about testing for drugs of abuse or their metabolites, we're really talking about some sort of mass spectrometric or MS technology. And quite frankly, this is true even if the screening test uses that MS technology. Labs are still labs. They involve people, and I'm not trying to take anything away from the quality of the labs, but you really want to be sure that there are no issues in the handling of that specimen and should always have 2 independent tests before the reporting of a positive, even when definitive technology is used for the screen. You need to have appropriate quality control. There needs to be certifying review, looking at all the analytical data, looking at the external, the internal chain of custody. And another really important tenet is that you have that the donor has the opportunity to have a retest or a split analysis. This is what's required under the DOT program. So from a technology perspective, screening tests are oftentimes performed using immunoassay. So some examples of that, probably the most common type of immunoassay that's used is an enzyme immunoassay, or EIA. ELISA is another type of immunoassay. Quite frankly, it's another form of a specific type of the EIA. CHEMS is another technology. There is FPIA. But no matter what type of test you're using, these screening tests are designed to be sensitive. That means no false negatives. However, with that sensitivity, you may not have the requisite specificity to be making adverse decisions. So in other words, by specificity, I mean you don't want to have false positives. So screening tests, no false negatives, but as a result, they may not be quite as specific as you like. And screening tests are also generally designed to rapidly eliminate negatives from further consideration. However, because when you're using these immunoassay techniques, they may react with other chemically or structurally similar compounds, confirmation using definitive techniques is always required. As I mentioned, that's true even if you use definitive techniques for the screen. So the confirmation tests, typically some type of chromatography, mass spectrometry, and I'll throw out a couple acronyms here: GCMS, GCMS-MS, LCMS, LCMS-MS, tandem mass spectrometry. They're all designed to specifically identify and quantify the drug or metabolite in the specimen, and they're considered definitive and they're recognized by the scientific and legal community. But breath testing, brings into play some unique challenges, I think. So for those of you that are familiar with hair, you understand that there are some different things, some unique challenges related to hair that you don't have with other specimen types, such as urine and oral fluid. And breath very much is the same way. So one of the foremost challenges is how are you going to capture the breath? It's easy to provide urine into a cup, collect oral fluid, cut a lock of hair, but how are you going to capture that breath? And once captured, you need to make sure that you have enough sample for all of the required tests, for the screen, for the confirmation, for a retest, any reanalysis that needs to occur. And in addition, that sample has to be stable, and you need to be able to reliably and reproducibly recover drug that's been captured with this device from the collection device. So if the testing paradigm, is able to meet these requirements and leverage these proven industry standard principles, there can be confidence in the accuracy and reliability of the test result.
Thanks, Barry. I sum that up as it's complicated, but there are best practices, and every sample type, hair, urine, oral fluid, breath, if it follows those best practices, there's still complexities, but if it has that foundation, that's really what we're looking at here, is that foundational best practice, that truth that transcends the specific sample types.
Hey, so, sorry, Aaron, maybe it's a specimen type. There's only one sample.
And he's a doctor. Good stuff. Thanks, Dr. Sample. On to the next one. So go ahead.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No. So we just talked urine, oral fluid, hair, breath. There's others. Why is it that different drug test types have different detection windows?
So there are a number of things that impact the detection windows, but at the risk of being a little geeky to begin with here, some of the main drivers that are driving these differences would be how the drug is administered. Is it injected? Is it inhaled? Is it ingested? Or is it even applied transdermally? Think about some of the CBD products that could have cannabinoids in them. Think about fentanyl patches and other drugs. All of those can impact the detection window. How is the drug distributed within the body? Is it fat soluble? Is it liquid, aqueous or liquid soluble? Is there a lot of protein binding? How much muscle mass does an individual have? What's their gender? And again, route of administration. That makes a difference. Something that's ingested has to pass through the liver prior to it entering the general circulation. So there's going to be a lot of what's known as first pass metabolism, as compared with an inhaled drug that immediately goes into the bloodstream. So there are, clearly differences in distribution that can impact those detection windows. Metabolism, gender, genetics can drive metabolic differences. And then how is it eliminated? Some drugs are eliminated primarily in the urine. Some may be more in the breath. Some may be more in the feces even. Not that I'm suggesting that type of testing, but different drugs are detectable for different periods of time based on the specific specimen type that's being used. And of course, the usage patterns. How frequently is somebody using it? How much are they using each time they use it? All of those will impact those detection windows. As an example, as we look at cannabis, in urine and hair, we test for the metabolite. In breath and oral fluid, we test for the parent compound. And very different detection windows, even though, if we just think of it generally as detecting cannabis use, whether it's THC or THC metabolite. But, hair doesn't bind THC metabolite as well as other drugs like cocaine. So therefore, it's less sensitive to marijuana use than cocaine. Oral fluid, in contrast, essentially detects really only oral cavity contamination by cannabis. because THC doesn't readily cross. It doesn't seem to cross from the blood into oral fluid like other drugs do. Cutoffs can play a role. Generally, the lower the cutoff, the longer the detection window. And probably one of the best examples I can think of is people think about DOT regulated programs, is when the DOT lowered their cocaine cutoffs in urine, positivity increased by 15 to 20%. Now, you can't say it's all because of the cutoff change, but I'm willing to bet that that cutoff change leading to increased sensitivity probably, and therefore a longer detection window, probably drove those increases. If we look at the various specimen types that are used in workforce drug testing, hair, start with in decreasing order of detection windows. Hair, we're talking about head hair, can detect up to 90 days of repetitive use based on the length of hair that's tested. But it doesn't does not detect single use. It's not informative about recent use. And it takes several days between the time the drug is used and the time that it's above the scalp and could be measured. Urine, we generally think of being detectable for 24 to 72 hours. Oral fluid, depending upon the drug, and of course usage patterns as well, 24 to 48 hours. So what I'd like to do, and Aaron, you sort of set this up earlier, and I want to drill down on this a little bit more, is introduce a new term that you're going to be hearing about more today, and it's this concept of proximate use. So oral fluid and urine are thought of as tests for recent use. Well, breath is also a test for recent use, but they have very different detection windows. So, by way of example, after single use of cannabis and oral fluid, it may only be positive for 24 hours. Perhaps a bit more, but 24 hours or so. Urine may be positive for 1 to 3 days. In contrast, breath is only positive for several hours. So it's hard for me to lump all of those into the broader recent use category. And I think we need to drill down a little bit more. So I like to think of, urine and oral fluid, and breath, of course, being recent use. This time window drives us to be thinking about the breath test more in the terms of proximate. How small, how close is the interval between use and testing? And therefore provide additional insights as to when, not just if, the substance was used. So as you can see, by the discussion we just had, the specific specimen type that's being utilized by an employer should be based on specific situational. It's very situational, I think. And it also needs to be based on the goals of their drug testing program.
Thank you, Doctor. Faye, Robin, anything to add to anything Barry's suggested this far? Happy to not have a response there, but saw a couple of facial tweaks that may have said perhaps there's a comment or a question to jump in with.
Well, let me start, Aaron. And obviously, I agree with everything Barry said. But I think what you have to do is really look back at, and he emphasized this, what's the goals of the individual program? What are the goals for an employer is it access to a facility? There's all sorts of issues that matter. And the identification of those issues are going to largely drive what sort of drug testing for cannabis is the most appropriate in a given circumstance. There's a lot of tools in the toolbox, and with breath coming online, there'll be even more. But the idea is, what's it good for? Let's be honest, breath pre-employment, not so sure that makes sense. Maybe it does in certain circumstances, they're going to put them out right away, but it may be an on-the-job or access. It may be that identification of what I call narrowing the window. Barry kind of alluded to that, of between use and a result. And having that knowledge might be important, or in some circumstances not. And I think that's one of the ways that really make a difference as we look at the types of drug testing programs that can be available.
Thanks, Faye. 100% agree. I think we have one more question for Dr. Sample. So let's talk about this idea of impairment. Barry, we've talked about this for 15 years. Why is it so difficult to define an impairment standard for cannabis? Can you walk us through that scientifically, technically?
Sure. I think you sort of set me up here. So, I mean, probably one of the questions I get asked the most is, if you can test for alcohol to determine if someone's impaired, why can't you do that for cannabis, especially now that we have the technology to detect THC in breath? And my answer to that is, I wish it was that simple. Unfortunately, and maybe I'm stepping into phase realm here a little bit, but I think perhaps some legislators thought that it could be easily done. So you can do it easily, detect impairment with alcohol. Why not with another legal drug now in our state, THC? What I think a lot of people fail to realize, and this got set up earlier as well, as alcohol had decades, literally decades of study. First in blood and then in breath. And it took a very, very long time for the scientific and legal consensus before there was a national standard and per se limits for blood alcohol levels, and then equivalency using breath testing devices. It was not overnight. It wasn't just a matter of a couple of years. It took a very, very long time. In the case of cannabis, it gets more complicated, because there's an active metabolite that's psychoactive. And to further compound the issue is the relative amount of this metabolite that's formed is dependent upon the route of administration. The THC in edibles first passes through the liver, immediately forming the active metabolite, while inhaled THC has to enter the blood and is distributed in the body before going to the liver. Consequently, there's much more active metabolite, relatively speaking, formed following the use of edibles versus smoking. Moreover, the peak effects of THC are not well correlated with blood concentration. Again, unlike alcohol, the peak effects for THC use that's inhaled lag behind blood concentrations. And as we've talked about, edibles can be even more complicated when you think about the lag time for absorption, distribution, the differences in metabolism. So it's very, very complicated, and it's not an easy nut to crack. To emphasize what others have said, traditionally, drug testing has not been about identifying drug use. It's really about an individual's behavior. Employers are trying to deter drug use, which could lead to someone using drugs and being impaired while working. So it's not about detecting impairment, it's about deterring use so that they're able to work in a safe manner. Workforce testing typically hasn't been about detecting all drug use, what some people call zero tolerance testing, or determining if someone's impaired. Quite frankly, assessing impairment is something that no hair, oral fluid, urine, or outside of alcohol, as Robin mentioned, even breath testing can do today. Maybe some point down the road, but today it's the technology and the science just isn't there. However, given this much shorter detection window of THC in breath, there may be a narrower inference of when cannabis may have been used relative to when the individual was being tested. And that could be useful and informative for employers.
Thank you, Barry. So Faye, we're going to transition your way, and I just want to make sure it's a fair setup, right? The employer perspective and, challenges with testing and having it be fair and safe. And then the scientific perspective of, drug testing is fairly complicated, but there are certain processes that reduce the risk and the complexity of those programs, shifting into this idea of impairment and the challenges there with THC and things. And it may not be feasible. I don't think you said that, Barry, but I kind of lean into it a bit of, is this idea of an impairment standard for cannabis in the short term right before us? It may not be. So then Faye, we'll kind of wrap it up with 2 or 3 questions your way. If what Barry said is true, and we have every reason to believe it is, why are so many state laws discussing impairment for cannabis? It seems like it's misaligned. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Sure. And let me feed off of what Barry said and what Robin said. So let's all step back and let's look at alcohol for a second. What we have today in the United States is a per se limit that we say is impairment. You understand the distinction? A person who doesn't drink may be able to have 1 drink and be impaired. Someone who, as we all know, is used to drinking may be able to have 5 drinks and be the same impaired. Our laws do not distinguish those 2 people. It is literally a per se limit that after decades, as Barry talked about, that we go, yep, you are over and now you're impaired. But it is not a scientific definition of impairment. So I want to start sort of bridging what Barry talked about to your question, Aaron. But if we keep that in effect, that we have all agreed of what an impairment is, but that is a legal standard. That is not a scientific standard. So now we go to everyone wants to talk about impairment in cannabis. Why is that? Because Barry already said it. It took decades to get to what we all agreed upon for alcohol, and we're nowhere near that. Nor are we, as a broader picture, on really any drug of abuse. Because previously, let's say more than 10 years ago and back, it was the presence of an illegal drug, and now I'm going to talk specifically in urine as the major type, and using the federally regulated standard, that was enough to remove people from a safety-sensitive position, even if the use was historical. And then as we come upon hair testing, for example, which goes back up to, let's say, 90 days under standard 1.5-inch head hair testing, what you're really picking up, potentially, because we don't know, is use more than 2 months ago. And that was determined societally, frankly, and for employers, that was enough to either not hire or come forward. So that was our sort of previous setting. And for cannabis, that has changed. That is no longer seen largely as an appropriate inquiry. We don't have to agree with what it is, but that is the fact of what's happening in the legislation. And we always see things at a local and state level long before we see it at a national level. So what we're seeing in changes in state law in the last 10 years, we've had medical cannabis now 25 years, or more. California went in 1996. But it is now an opinion, perhaps societally, or at least a majority or a portion of the populace, that this previous criteria of a historical illegal use may have been over-inclusive and not targeted enough to correlate it to a current safety risk. And therefore, the search was on for, okay, if that's not what we want to use, what do we use? And that started this idea of impairment. And impairment is a word that is tossed around a lot, and it is not a defined standard. If anyone who's done cannabis legalization talks, and if you attended the one earlier with DISA, you'll know that impairment varies. The definitions vary across the country. I think it's, if you know it, if you see it, well, maybe you do and maybe you don't. It depends how that state has defined impairment. And what it generally means, this is so oversimplified, everyone needs to look at the states they care about, but it's the objective signs and symptoms. But more importantly, what's it not? It's not a drug test that measures historical use and presence of an analyte. Okay? So The question in a urine test, a hair test, an oral fluid test, or as Barry even talked about at this moment, a breath test. There's information there, but it is not impairment. And in many states, the test result cannot be used absent other stuff. Not all states are this way. This is a, as I like to call it, sort of sometimes is we're going to look back in history and look at the American experiment in cannabis. No other nation has ever approached it the way we've approached it, but that's where we're at. And so impairment is a complex topic legally. It is an individualized, and I believe we are some distance away, perhaps decades, I don't know, for what it means on a national basis. But this is why the new state laws are focusing on impairment, trying to balance safety. Legislators should go, it's impaired, you don't have to do anything else, with the scientific reality of we can't determine it. And the wish to have a safe workplace. And that's a conundrum employers and frankly, employees. We all want safety in the workplace and the workforce. But how to get there in a solid scientific manner, as we heard from Barry, could be difficult.
Thank you, Faye. We'll jump to the next one. So the last couple of slides have touched on legalization. What's next? Like, what's your crystal ball tell you is coming up?
Well, my crystal ball is, on this one, the general trends I think are pretty darn good. The individualization may have a little cloudiness, but the bottom line is expect states to continue to legalize. Do I think federal legalization is eventually likely? We've heard President Biden make statements on that. Do I think it's imminent? Probably not. Do I think it's eventually likely? 100%. It is. The trend is going. You could look at voter polls. How it gets enacted will be interesting, but we do see a move towards decriminalization, which is a more accurate than legalization. It'll be removing the criminal penalties under certain circumstances. In our particular, the workforce, I do think we're going to continue to see employment protections in accordance with legal off-duty use. And instead focusing on this idea of impairment. And this is only heightened by the constricted labor force, which our people in demographics seem to think will continue to where we're at in this country. So we're going to end up seeing this go forward, and we're going to see the complexities. We are not probably going to see any consensus, particularly in employment protections, that it's likely always to be a state by state, because generally employment matters are reserved to the states to handle as they want. So we're going to continue to have workforce impairment, and we're going to need to have all the tools to get as close to that as we can.
So the trend likely to continue. So the employer approach of, I'm just going to stop testing for it, I'm going to be the ostrich with my head in the sand, may not be long-term feasible. Maybe short-term, it was a fine experiment, to kind of use your word previously, but the trend continues. It needs to be assessed and addressed.
I would tell you that employers, the goal of safety, drug testing is a valuable tool with workplace safety and workforce safety. Are there difficulties or complexities in continue to test for cannabis? 100%. Does that mean the endeavor is not worth doing? Absolutely not. Safety is valuable, and the tools we have are valuable tools to workplace safety. And for all the reasons that Robin talked about, for the reasons why a robust workplace drug testing policy is important.
Thanks, Barry. I think we have time for one more. So laws are changing. Those changes will continue. It's a broad question, but how should employers navigate these changing laws? What's your advice?
First off, you have to know where you have employees. Location, location, location. Secondly, look at your workforce. Is it safety sensitive? Is it clerical? Make some important business decisions of risks. Have consistent treatment, whether it's stand down, last chance agreements, which are becoming a very important factor in our drug testing scenario. And also, the question I'm asked more often for multi-state consider all the applicable state laws, not just where the company is located.
Easy. Finally, an easy one.
No, I wouldn't call it easy, but it is concise.
Thank you, Faye. Fantastic. All right. So for the sake of time, I think we have one slide to, perhaps one more slide to wrap it up. So my dad always told me, tell them what you're going to tell them and tell them what you told them. So this slide's a little bit of our tell them what you told them. And Faye, I get we had one more question in there. I think we can squeeze that one out. If you want to speak to that a little bit, you can certainly speak to it here as we kind of wrap up the legal perspective.
I will do one thing, and I think it's the question I'm asked is, as breath comes online, what does that mean legally? And I think my summary to that is a bit of uncertainty because it hasn't come online yet. Having said that, it relies on established technologies. People are familiar with breath alcohol and understand that breath is a viable means to get drug. And I think using the principles that Barry talked about, two-tiered testing, a right for a retest, all of that, it will be, the courts are likely to look on it more favorably because it's not just, we're really relying on what is already established in really a novel way of approaching it.
Thanks, Faye. All right, so the employer perspective, the science perspective, the legal perspective, from an employer's perspective, it really is that focus on policy. Who do you test? When do you test them? How do you test? And the tools to support them all. This idea of creating win-wins, like we talk about this all the time in the industry. It's what are those wins to the employer about reducing risk, and to the employee of enhancing fairness, and to the HR team of expanding candidate pools, and to the finance team of driving ROI. It's really, how can you find those tools to align with the policy to build these win-wins? And then generally, cannabis breath testing is an emerging tool with a focus on that proximate use. That's a good term that we've created here. So we'll hear more about proximate use as we go, for sure. From a science perspective, Barry, it's complicated, but as you develop new technologies, if they leverage those long-standing testing principles, it removes the risk, it removes a bit of the variability, and it's got a solid foundation to kind of build upon. And breath testing is a proximate use test that provides key insights into when, not just if, THC was ingested. Again, one more tool in the toolbox. But from a legal perspective, Faye, your perspective from the crystal ball that's fairly clear is that legalization likely to expand. This idea of impairment language in the state laws, even though there might not be an impairment standard in drug testing, is a bit disconnected, but really the intent there is this attempt to balance workforce safety and fairness. So we're trying to thread that needle a bit as we align testing programs and policies and the laws. And then generally, bottom line, we say this all the time, but drug testing policy should be consistently applied, clearly communicated, and legally compliant. So I think that kind of brings us back to the first bullet under Robin's section of a focus on really good policy. So that's what are you going to tell them? What'd you say? And then kind of wrap it up. Any closing thoughts with a minute or two to go from anybody else in the panel before we jump into one last outro slide? All right. Last outro slide it is. Just a thank you, right? Thanks to Day with DISA for the opportunity. Thanks to all the attendees who have dialed in to listen to the output from today. Thanks to Robin for your Chevron employer perspective, and Barry for your 30 to 40 years of science background and industry experience. And Faye, you're deep in it just like the rest of us. Thank you for all your legal trends and perspectives and that crystal ball. It really is a panel of experts. I appreciate your time and all the prep work and all the outputs here. We have listed email addresses, which tend to be the easiest, most assured way of reconnecting with folks. So if you have specific questions, you can reach out to any of our panelists. I think DISA also has a chat feature. You can put your questions in there and we'll circle back with those responses as we're able. So just thank you, everybody. Great session. I hope it was educational and informative. Have a great rest of your day. Thanks very much.